All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's our next lesson in Unit 4. This is Plantation Life in the Colonies and the Slave Trade. So I know that I've mentioned these things before. I've talked about plantation life. I've talked about life in the English, the French, and the Spanish colonies. And I've briefly mentioned slavery, but now we're going to take a deep dive and a deep look into all of those things. One thing I do want to remind you of before we begin is that this is AP World History. So we'll very much be looking at the general effects of slavery across the whole world. For those of you who are much more interested in the experience of slaves in the United States, you're going to have to wait until next year when you're in AP US history to really look at that, simply because I have a lot of information I need to cover it. And I can't just focus on the United States of America, because that would be unfair to all of the other countries in the world that also experience slavery. So obviously we will talk about the United States, but we're not going to focus on the United States. Let's go ahead and begin with our essential questions. We're still looking at the various reasons Europeans established maritime empires, and we're looking at those various effects of the maritime empires, namely the institution and perpetuation of slavery. We're also actually, I'm going to add this one here, we're also looking for changes in continuities. We can see that there are many changes occurring during this particular time period, but there's still some continuities as well that we want to be able to address. Now, in our synchronous learning session, we'll be using multiple documents in order to create and support a claim. Our FRQ, our essay for this unit, is going to be a DBQ. That's why I'm throwing so many documents at you, so that way we can get some good practice in preparation for that portion of the exam. Let's go ahead and actually start with a story here. So this is a slightly humorous story, at least. So this right here is a man named Henry Brown. Now, Henry Brown was a slave in Virginia, and he wanted to escape Virginia. He wanted to escape slavery. And so he devised a plan. In 1849, one day, he burnt his arm with sulfuric acid, just enough where he wouldn't be able to work. And so the plantation owner lets him go and says, fine, go take a rest day, because clearly you're not going to work because you burned yourself. Henry Brown takes this opportunity to enact this plan that he's been putting together for the last couple years. He finds the other members who are in on the plan with him, and they put him in this box. And this box is a very small box. It has one hole for breathing. It has like a little bit of bread and a little bit of water in it. And that's really about it. Now, these friends take this box, and it's marked with the dry goods. It just says dry goods on it. No one knows that Henry Brown is in there, and they load this onto a train, and this train takes it across the border of Virginia into Pennsylvania, which is a free state within the United States of America. Henry Brown then pops out of the box and sings a psalm about his freedom and gains the name Henry Box Brown. It took him 27 hours to get across the border from Virginia to Pennsylvania. So it was 27 hours he had to put in order to finally earn his freedom. And while that is a very humorous story and something that we can laugh at a little bit, it does bring up a few questions that we really need to address. Number one, how did a man of African descent come to be in the New World? We'll be looking at the Middle Passage in a little bit, and we'll see how slaves were brought from mainly West Africa all the way over to what we now consider the New World. Two, what horrors of the slave system would compel him to undergo such a dangerous mission? I mean, none of us would be one to crammed in a box. And this box makes it look big. It makes it look like it was comfortable. It was very much not comfortable. I mean, he was in there almost in like the fetal position in that box for 27 hours. So what is going on in slavery that would compel someone to take a journey like this, to really put their life in danger? And the last one is, why were different forms of coerced labor used in the New World? So we know that we have people of African descent. We know that the slave system is absolutely horrible. Why would it be put forth in the first place? We'll be looking at all those things in this presentation today. Let's actually go back way back to Unit 2. In Unit 2, we talked about the Indian Ocean Exchange, and I briefly mentioned that there was slavery in the Indian Ocean Exchange, and that is still true. It's something that we need to keep in mind, is that slavery has existed as pretty much as long as human beings have existed. Obviously, that does not make it okay. It's just something that we need to address and know as a class. So what we see here is the slave trade within the Indian Ocean Exchange. Now, a couple things I want you guys to keep in mind is one, this is significantly smaller than the Middle Passage. And two, arguably more importantly, many of these slaves are domestic slaves. And when I say domestic slaves, I mean that they are working in homes or they are traveling with their masters, and that's really about it. They're certainly not working in on plantations or in sugar plantations or cotton plantations or putting in 14-hour days in the hot sun. There's nothing like that. It's more just these slaves are property of the owners and they do these day-to-day tasks for their masters. So it is a lot different than what we are going to be looking at in just a little bit here. Let's start in Africa because that makes the most sense to start. And oftentimes throughout history, we forget Africa. We talk about things from the United States point of view, or we talk things about things from the European point of view. Let's look at it from the African point of view, at least for the beginning here. So I've already mentioned the Kingdom of the Congo in a previous lecture, but the Kingdom of the Congo is in modern day Angola. And we know that the Portuguese were the ones setting up their trading post empire. Remember, people like Vasco da Gama are going down the western coast of Africa around South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and they're coming back up to India. So one of the places they stop is the Kingdom of the Congo. And that has the fact that the Portuguese are interacting with the Kingdom of the Congo has profound effects for both societies. One, the Portuguese have access to gold, ivory, and slaves. The second thing is that the Kingdom of the Congo will eventually convert to Christianity, which is the religion of the Portuguese. As we see in this painting here, this is a Christian wedding that's happening in the Congo. And we know that whenever religion is spread, it's going to sync up with other religions. So this type of Christianity is going to be significantly different than the Portuguese Christianity, but they're still going to believe in the basic tenets of God and Jesus and all of those other things. Now, what we're eventually going to see is that this area, modern day Angola, is going to be colonized by the Portuguese and will become one of the first areas in sub-Saharan Africa to become Christian. We'll discuss this more in Unit 6, but one thing I do want to point out is I was watching a TV show. Now, this happens to be a German TV show, and in this German TV show, not to get too into it, but they go to Angola. And one of the people they meet in Angola, his name is Roberto, and he's of African descent. And that seems kind of odd. I mean, Roberto is definitely a Hispanic name, but this person is certainly Angolan, obviously of African descent. The reason that that occurs is because Angola was a former Portuguese colony. So you can still see some of the vestiges and some of the impact even today that Portugal had on Angola. And we'll discuss this more. We'll discuss the long-term effects of this colonization when we get to Unit 6, because it is so profound and in a very negative way, obviously. And it's something that still affects our modern world today. Let's talk about the Songhai. I've talked about the Songhai Empire before, but they've replaced the Mali Empire. So the Mali Empire was in West Africa. They traded gold, ivory, and slaves. The big change now is the Songhai Empire. They still trade gold, ivory, and slaves. That's very much a continuity. Sonny Ali is going to be the Ivan the Terrible or the Salim the Grim of the Mali Empire. He's going to, of the Songhai Empire. He's going to expand the Songhai Empire through warfare. It will be Askia Mohammed who comes after him, who really makes Songhai a place of intelligence by giving more money to academics and by setting up schools all over the place and really using the Muslim faith in order to centralize his rule. For this particular portion of our study of world history, we need to know that the Songhai Empire was a place that traded slaves for weapons. Constantly, the Songhai Empire had to defend themselves from other African empires. And so they were more than willing to exchange prisoners of war and other captured Africans in order to obtain weapons, mainly guns and horses from the Europeans. It's all this fighting that occurs, and this fighting is continued to be financed by Europeans. It's kind of similar to what we saw with the Tokugawa shogunate. We saw that the Portuguese were giving guns to the people of Japan, and that's what caused the Civil War, eventually causing the Tokugawa shogunate to rise up and take control and centralize his rule. It's Europeans giving horses, giving weapons that make these wars continue to occur. If we look at this here, actually, this map does a very good job at showing all of the various um, African kingdoms. So we can see the Songhai, the Ghana, the Mali, all in the same spot. We even have the Asante down here, the Kingdom of the Congo. There's obviously a lot of people in Africa and a lot of different societies. All of these societies can tend to fight with one another. And that's a essential part of the African slave trade, is that all of these societies, since they're fighting with one another, have many prisoners of war, and Europeans are going to take these prisoners of war across the Atlantic Ocean, as we'll talk about in just a second. The Asante Kingdom was a small group that was centralized around the Golden Stool. The Golden Stool is their throne, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Unit 6 and we see the British try to fight against the Asante in the War of the Golden Stool. Now, they take some of the territory that Ghana, Mali, and even a little bit of the Songhai, so they are right there. Once again, slavery existed within this kingdom because slavery has almost always existed, but it's not the type of slavery that we think about. It's not chattel slavery, as we'll go over in just a second. It's more of this domestic slavery that I talked about briefly before. They are going to trade gold, ivory, and slaves with the Portuguese and with other Europeans like the British, as we'll talk about more in Unit 6. So those are the major African kingdoms that we need to be aware of when we're talking about the slave trade. Now let's actually talk about the Middle Passage. So this is the Middle Passage right here. This is the path that slaves were forced upon. So boats from Europe would show up. Actually, I'll give you a map in just a second that shows this better. But boats from Europe would show up. They would get slaves. They would force slaves onto their ships. And they would trade guns and horses for them. These slaves would be taken across the Atlantic Ocean in absolutely horrendous conditions that I will do a poor job at explaining, but I'll be able to have a picture that really illustrates it and shows the horrors of that and takes them across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. Couple things I want to point out. We in the United States obviously focus on the United States. As you can see, there's only a small portion of these slaves actually go to the United States of America. Now, that doesn't mean I'm defending slavery in the United States. I'm certainly not doing that. In fact, I'm doing the opposite of that. I absolutely abhor slavery within the United States. The reason I bring it up is because we are students of world history. You'll focus on this in U.S. history, and you'll talk about the conditions that slaves had to go through within the United States, and you'll talk about the long-term impacts of slavery on the culture of the United States of America. I'm mainly going to be focusing on these other areas of the world. So we see that many slaves were brought to Brazil and forced to work on sugar plantations. And we see that millions of slaves were brought to the Caribbean, places like Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and were forced to work mainly on sugar plantations as well. This is part of the reason, actually mainly 100% of the reason, why 100% of the people who live in Haiti today of our African descent. And we saw that when we looked at the Colombian exchange and we saw that data there. This is the reason why. Now, in totality, about 12 million Africans from the west coast of Africa mainly are going to be taken and put into slavery in the New World. We can imagine this has profound effects on the New World and on Africa as well. And we'll talk about that in just a second. This slave trade is going to begin in the 1500s with the first slaves arriving in the United States in the year 1619. And the slave trade will be stopped in 1807 by Britain and stopped in 1808 by the United States. The reason I put stopped in quotes is because it's officially stopped. I mean, there's legislation that's passed that said no more slave trade whatsoever, but smuggling is going to continue all the way until the 1860s. So yeah, it officially stops, but unofficially it continues on if you at least understand what I mean there. This Middle Passage is part of a bigger trading system called the triangular trade. So what we see is, we'll start with the Middle Passage because we already went with that, is that Africans are taken from West Africa and taken to the New World. That is this right here. That is the Middle Passage. From here, slaves are forced to work in the Caribbean and in the United States and in Brazil. Let's just focus on this area of the world, not because there's no slaves down here. There's a lot of slaves down here, but simply because it just makes it a little easier to explain. So things like cotton and sugar and other raw materials are grown by slaves who are forced and coerced in order to do work. All of these raw materials are then sent back to Europe. Not just England, but all of Europe. It's mainly England's going to dominate this, and they're going to do very well because these are English colonies. But we can assume that this is the same for all of Europe. Now, places like Europe are going to manufacture goods, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later in Unit 4 when we talk about the economics behind all of this, and then in Unit 5 when we look at exactly what England was doing during this time period. But we see that places like England are manufacturing goods. They're making things like chairs and tables and guns, things where you actually need to put it all together. You take the raw materials and put it together. And once they've done so, they take those raw materials, they sell it back to their colonies, or they take it down to Africa and they sell those manufactured goods or trade those manufactured goods for slaves. And then the cycle repeats. So it's slaves being brought in order to create cheap raw materials for the Europeans to greatly benefit because they sell their manufactured goods. We'll discuss this more, as I said, when we look at the economics behind all of this and we understand why Europe gained so much wealth in such a short amount of time. Let's talk about the slave trade here. So once again, as I said earlier, I don't do that great of a job describing the horrors of slavery. There's only so much a one person can do to describe something that was so awful. But what we have here is a blueprint of a British slave ship. As you see here, and maybe it's a little bit difficult because it's not exactly a huge picture here, but all of these little images here, all these little heads, those all represent slaves. The reason that this blueprint was created was to show how many slaves could be fit into a slave ship. What we really should be noticing is that these slaves are treated like cargo. Okay, there's no worry about do they have enough room or do they have enough food or do they have enough oxygen. They're shoved in there as if they were objects. And that's actually how slaves were treated. If you can really understand that many Europeans saw slaves as objects for them to use in order to benefit their own lives, then you really understand the slave trade and you understand some of the motivations behind it. So this is obviously is a very famous picture and you can look it up as well in case you can't see it on my screen. Let's talk about the effects here for the New World. The first one's the African diaspora. We talked about the Jewish diaspora earlier, where you had Jews who were forced out of their homeland and spread throughout the entirety of the world. Well, in this case, we have an African diaspora in which many people, 12.5 million people from West Africa, are dispersed all throughout the New World. This is why there's many people of African descent in Brazil and the Dominican Republic and Haiti and in the United States of America. It's because they were forced into the Middle Passage and across the Atlantic Ocean. They are given a very low social class. They are slaves. And these are not slaves like the Janissaries were slaves. The Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire were technically slaves, but they could rise up through their political and military knowledge. In this case, these slaves were the lowest of the low in terms of social class. We call this chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is what existed in the United States. So this is the type of slavery in which you have slaves working on plantations, doing manual labor for 12 to 14 hours a day. That's what we need to keep in mind here. So when you get to the test, and they often like doing this on the test where they throw in a word like chattel slavery. And what happens is that students don't know what the word chattel means. And so they freak out and they don't write anything and they end up getting it wrong. So you know that chattel slavery is just what we usually think of when we think of the word slavery. So don't be scared of that word when you see it on the test. As we should know from our seventh grade U.S. history class, there were brutal working conditions. In fact, these sugar plantations were known to be the worst. If we go back to the map here, in Brazil, especially in Brazil, Brazil was most notorious for this, is they had a lot of sugar plantations, and so many of these slaves were treated so awfully that they were killed before they could ever have children, which is why they had to bring more slaves into Brazil. In the United States, slaves were treated awfully, but for the most part, were kept alive in order to reproduce, in order to have more children who would then automatically be slaves, which is why there's not as many slaves from West Africa who are coming to the New World. Once again, I am not trying to say that slavery in the United States was a good thing. I'm in fact saying that it was a bad thing, because what the United States did is that they pretty much forced slaves in order to have more children, in order to beget more slaves and have more slaves within the United States. So keep all of that in mind here. I am not trying to say that slavery is a good thing. I'm just trying to point out some of the factual information about the differences between slavery in Brazil and slavery in the United States. Let's go ahead and go back to our effects here. Now, because there's so many slaves being brought over or being born in places like the United States, and there's going to be a synchronization of cultures. We call this synchronization Creole, and this is a syncretism between traditional African society and then European society. So there's a language syncretism called Creole, in which it combines European and African words. But that's not the only type of syncretism that exists. Music was a blend of European and African music. Food, like gumbo, is a combination of traditional African dishes with European dishes, and religion as well. Many of the slaves are going to be converted to Christianity. What they do, what happens, and as always happens with religion, is that they combine their local religions that they had in West Africa with this new Christian religion that is being forced upon them in the New World, to create something that's a little bit different. So this type of Christianity is going to be different than the type of Christianity that existed in places that didn't have slavery. So, for example, within the United States, Christians in Maine are certainly going to be different than Christian slaves in Georgia. If we're talking about Africa, and oftentimes we forget to talk about the other side here. We often talk about the effects in the New World, but not the effects of the old one. So let's make sure we look at those. This is going to greatly enrich the kingdoms of the Asante and the Congo, but it's also going to allow them to continue to fight against one another. The infighting will continue to occur because of all the weapons that are brought into Africa. In addition to this, many of these societies become dependent on European manufactured goods, which is bad for the Kingdom of the Congo and the Kingdom of the Asante, because it means they're not producing their own manufactured goods. This is also going to break many of the kin-based structures and economies. I mean, they are losing 12.5 million men, mainly men. When you lose 12.5 million people from your society is not going to be able to function anymore. Whether you're looking at the family structure, whether you're looking at the economy, those things are going to take a hit, because so many people are being removed from that particular society. So we want to keep this in mind, that this greatly helps Europe, because they are the ones to receive the benefit, as we see in the triangular trade here, and greatly hurts Africa because of all the people who are being removed and taken out of the west part of Africa. Let's talk about resistance very, very quickly here, because there is a lot of resistance. There are some people, even still in the United States today, that say that, slavery couldn't possibly be that bad because slaves didn't ever resist. Well, that's just not a true statement, because slavery was awful and people did resist. The first one we want to look at is Ana Nzinga. She's the ruler of the Ndongo in present day Angola. So she was very much going against the Kingdom of the Congo. Her and the Kingdom of the Congo were almost constantly fighting against one another. Now, Ana Nzinga actually has a whole lot of power. And so when we are talking about women in power, if there's a test question about women in power, we can certainly use Ana Nzinga as an example. And let me give you a quick example here. Anna Nzinga had a harem full of men. Last time we used the word harem was when we were talking about the Ottoman Empire, and we looked at Suleiman the Magnificent, and he had his harem of women. He had multiple wives that he kept around in his palaces. Anna Nzinga would keep multiple men in her palaces, and what she would actually do is she would have them fight to the death. These men would fight against one another. The winner, the one who killed all the other men, got to sleep with or stay with Anna Nzinga that night, and then she would have him killed in the morning. So she's incredibly powerful. You definitely don't want to mess with her. She rebelled against the Portuguese and other African nations who looked to take slaves from her. So the Ndongo were a smaller society, and so the Portuguese were trying to take slaves, but other African nations like the Kingdom of the Congo were also trying to take members of the Ndongo tribe in order to sell into slavery to enrich themselves. So we see Anna Nzinga continues to fight against the Portuguese in order to stop this slave trade at its source. Now, if we transfer over to the New World, there are other slave rebellions in the United States, and we can assume in all the other parts of the Americas as well. The Stono Rebellion is going to be one of the big ones. This will take place in South Carolina, back when it's a colony, because this is in 1739. 25 colonists will be killed and 50 slaves will be killed in this rebellion. The other big one is the Turner Rebellion that takes place in Virginia about 30 years before the Civil War. 55 whites and 60 slaves are going to be killed in the Nat Turner Rebellion. So there are examples of resistance to slavery at both the source of slaves and where slaves end up in the New World. Another resistance to slavery was more through the legal means, and this was William Wilberforce. He was this British politician who was very pious, very Christian. He wasn't a priest or anything, but obviously a very religious man. And once he learned about slavery, he was absolutely horrified by it. And this is kind of where we need to step into the shoes of William Wilberforce, because you might hear me say he found out about slavery, and that might seem weird to you. Like, how do you not know about the horrors of slavery? But think about our own lives. Think about things that happen all over the world, well outside the United States. I mean, there are some horrible things that happen in other countries, and I'm not going to get too specific here, but we're generally unaware of those things. At times we kind of live in this bubble where we're unaware of how other people live and how other people are treated. And so we can't necessarily blame William Wilberforce for not knowing. I mean, this is a guy who's in the upper echelon, the upper classes of British society. He's not the one who's interacting with slaves. He's not the one who's interacting with slave traders. He's not the one who's interacting with plantation owners in the New World. He lives in his bubble society. And so we need to keep that in mind, not only for our study of history, but even in our own world as well. Let's go ahead and move on. Wilberforce, as I said, becomes aware of this, and he starts to pass laws. He starts to pressure Parliament to stop the slave trade. The slave trade will officially end in 1807 for the British, in 1808 for the United States, and slavery will be over in the British Empire in the year 1833. That obviously does not include the United States, because the United States was no longer a part of the British Empire in 1833. The slavery will obviously not end in the United States until after the Civil War in 1865. And then from there, there are profound long-term effects that you'll study more when you get to AP US history. A couple review things very, very quickly, because I do want to talk about English, French, and Spanish colonies very, very quickly, just to make sure we're all caught up on that. So the life in the English colony, they had indentured servants who I've talked about before, who worked for 7 or 8 years for free passage. And then oftentimes they ended up staying within that same labor, even within that same system, because they never gained enough money to move up in society. Slaves were used mainly in southern colonies within those English colonies in the United States, because that's where it made the most sense to use slaves. Didn't really make much sense to use slaves in the North, because the North was mainly manufacturing, and the North didn't have as much agriculture. It was the southern colonies that had a lot of agriculture and a lot of cotton, which made slavery very useful. The major cash crops will be cotton and then coming out of Virginia, tobacco. And we see that there is resistance. We already saw resistance to slavery with the Stoner Rebellion and Turner's Rebellion, but we also talked about King Philip or Metacom's war, in which the natives tried to resist the expansion of the English into the western part of the United States. In the French colony, the French were much more likely to team up with the natives in order to find beaver fur to trade, and they converted many of the natives as many of the Jesuits founded these Catholic schools. The exception to this is in Haiti. The French imported many African slaves because in Haiti, the climate is perfect for sugar, and there's a lot of manual labor that needs to be put in order to grow sugar, and the French want to use slaves in order to get this done. Haiti actually becomes the most profitable part of the French Empire, even though Haiti is just a small little island. The last one is the life in this Spanish colony. There is a casta system, and little alarm bells should be going off in your head because casta sounds like caste, and that's what it is. When we study Hinduism, we went over the caste system. The casta system is the caste system, it's just in Spanish. Now, within these Spanish colonies, I talk about the encomienda, I talk about the hacienda system. There's another system that's in place at the same time, and that is this system here. It is this very highly rigid social structure. And we want to know this social structure now because it's going to become a very important part when we look at the revolutions in Unit 5. So up at the very top are people called peninsulares. These are people who are born in Spain, who come to the New World and set up plantations. They are given haciendas. They're given this whole lot of land in which they're going to force natives and some African slaves to actually grow crops on that land. Then the peninsulares go back to Spain. They're very much absentee landlords. They own the land, but they're really not there. You have Creoles. We talked about how Creole was a combination of European and African descent. But in the Spanish system, in the Casa system, it's a little bit different. Creoles are people who are of European descent, but they're born in the colonies. So maybe your mom and dad were from Spain, but you are born in the colonies. You are born in the New World. Beneath the Creoles are the mestizos and mulattoes. These are actually considered very derogatory terms today, so normally I wouldn't use those. The only reason I'm using those in class is simply because I want to show you an actual factual account of history. Mestizos were people who were Native American and European. Mulattoes were people who were African and European descent. And then beneath them were people of full 100% Native descent or people of full 100% African descent. Now, what we see here is a Costa painting, and these Costa paintings were used almost as propaganda in order to show people how they were to act. So, for example, this is a Peninsulares right here, and he intermarried. He married someone who was a mestizo, who was part European, part Native American, and they looks like they have a daughter right here. Now, the way this Casa painting is presented, it shows a very rich and wealthy life. I mean, these people are dressed up in the nicest clothes. You would imagine that they're the ones not working on the plantations. They're the ones who own these haciendas or these very large landed estates. If I had another Costa painting, I would show you maybe an example of how Native Americans or people of African descent were depicted. They were usually depicted working on the land in very in wearing rags and horrible clothes because that's where they were supposed to be according to the Costa system. So what the Costa system did and what these Costa paintings did is tell people what they are supposed to do, what their role in society was, whether that was to be the peninsulares and the owner of the hacienda, or whether that was to be the slaves and to be the workers on that hacienda. Now, with this Casa system here, every single group of people hates the other group of people. For example, the mestizos, mulattoes, and the people of Native and African descent are going to hate the Creoles. The Creoles are going to hate these guys, and they're going to hate the Peninsulares. The Peninsulares are going to hate all these people, and the Peninsulares are going to also hate the King and Queen of Spain. So there's going to be a lot of animosity, a lot of hatred amongst everyone, and that's eventually going to cause a rebellion and a revolution, as we're going to see in Unit 5. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where we're going to end our lecture today. I do apologize for the length, but hopefully you got all of that information there. And please make sure you bring your notes to class so you're prepared to partake in our activities.